Go on, ask her yourself, Alistair boomed, his voice echoing across the grand dining room as he gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Talk to my dumb wife. I promise you, it's like talking to a beautiful brick wall. The men around him erupted in laughter, but the maid, standing silently by the wall, felt a cold fury rise within her. Hello, my amazing family and friends. I'm so glad you're here with me again today. If you're ready to dive into another powerful story, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment telling me the country or city you're watching from. And guess what? Tomorrow, I've got another story lined up that will leave you just as captivated, so don't miss it. Now, let's get started. The air in the Sterling mansion was thick with the scent of money. It smelled of aged leather from the towering bookshelves, of exotic flowers flown in from some tropical paradise, and of the expensive perfume that clung to the guests like a second skin. At the head of a long, polished mahogany table, Alistair Sterling held court. He was a man built of sharp angles and sharper ambition, his pinstripe suit tailored to perfection, a heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist every time he gestured, which was often. His voice was a practiced performance, rising and falling with theatrical charm as he told a story about a hostile takeover, making corporate ruthlessness sound like a grand adventure. The men at his table, a collection of investors and rivals, hung on his every word, their laughter a chorus of approval. Alistair was the sun, and everyone else was just a planet orbiting his immense ego. At the other end of this solar system, almost eclipsed by his brilliance, sat his wife, Annalise. She was a vision in a gown of shimmering gold sequins, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant twist that exposed the delicate curve of her neck. She was, by all accounts, the perfect accessory to a man like Alistair. Beautiful, poised, and utterly silent. While laughter and loud talk filled the room, Annalise's world was small and quiet. Her eyes, a soft shade of blue, weren't on the faces of the guests. They were fixed on the tiny, intricate patterns of the tablecloth, tracing the delicate threads with her gaze. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her posture so straight it looked painful, as if she were bracing for an impact that never came. She was a statue in a museum, placed for admiration but not for interaction. A few times, a guest, usually a newcomer unfamiliar with the house rules, would try to draw her into conversation. Annalise, this wine is exquisite. Did you choose it? They might ask. Before she could even form a response, or even a flicker of one, Alistair's voice would cut through the air. Annalise has a taste for simple things, he would say with a wink, answering for her. I handle the important decisions. And the conversation would move on, leaving her once again in her bubble of silence. Have you ever witnessed someone being slowly erased by another person's cruelty, forced into a corner of silence? Let me know in the comments below what you think is the best way to help someone find their voice again. Moving silently along the perimeter of the room was Cora. It was her first night working at the Sterling mansion, a temporary job procured through a high-end agency that catered to the city's elite. Her uniform was simple and stark, a black dress with a crisp white apron. Her instructions had been clear: be invisible, anticipate needs before they are spoken, and never, ever interrupt the guests. Cora was good at her job. She moved with a fluid grace, refilling a wine glass before it was empty, clearing a plate the moment a fork was set down. She was a ghost in the background, a pair of hands ensuring the seamless flow of the evening. But behind her professional, neutral expression, Cora's eyes missed nothing. She saw the way Alistair's smile never quite reached his eyes, especially when he looked at his wife. She saw the forced quality of the guests' laughter, a little too loud, a little too eager to please the man who held their fortunes in his hands. Most of all, she saw Annalise. She saw the flicker of pain that crossed Annalise's face when her husband dismissed her. She saw how Annalise's knuckles turned white under the table, a tiny betrayal of the calm facade she presented to the world. Cora had seen men like Alistair before, men who built their own sense of importance by tearing down the people closest to them. It was a familiar, ugly kind of power, and it made a bitter taste rise in her throat. For a moment, Cora focused on her task, polishing an already gleaming silver pitcher. Her movements were precise, automatic. She had bills to pay, a life to manage. Getting involved was not an option. Her role was to serve, not to judge. She just had to get through the night, collect her pay, and forget the quiet tragedy playing out at the dinner table. But as she watched Annalise, a woman who looked like she had everything but was trapped in a gilded cage, Cora felt a familiar tug of anger. It was an old, deep-seated feeling, one that reminded her of a promise she had made to herself a long time ago, to never stand by and watch silently while someone was being crushed. The evening wore on, a long, slow procession of courses and conversations dominated by Alistair. A guest, a younger man named Julian who seemed less intimidated than the others, turned to Annalise with a genuine smile. "Annalise," he said, his voice kind. "I heard you're a gifted pianist. My mother used to play. I've always admired the dedication it takes." For the first time all night, a light flickered in Annalise's eyes. Her lips parted slightly, as if a word was fighting its way to the surface. She looked at Julian, a hint of surprise and gratitude on her face. But the moment was fragile, a soap bubble waiting to be popped. And Alistair, sensing he was no longer the center of attention, swooped in with a broad, condescending grin. He clapped Julian on the shoulder, a gesture that was more of a power play than a friendly touch. "A pianist?" Alistair laughed, a loud, grating sound. "Oh, she tinkers a bit. It keeps her busy." Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial roar that was meant for the whole table to hear. "But if you want a real conversation," he said, pointing a thumb back at his wife, who had frozen completely, "good luck with that." And then came the words that would shatter the evening. "Go on, ask her yourself. Talk to my dumb wife. I promise you, it's like talking to a beautiful brick wall." The laughter that followed was sharp and immediate, a crack of thunder in the tense atmosphere. It wasn't a sound of genuine amusement. It was the nervous, obligatory laughter of men who knew which side their bread was buttered on. They laughed because Alistair Sterling expected them to, because his approval was a currency more valuable than their own decency. Julian's smile vanished, replaced by a look of horrified embarrassment. He glanced at Annalise, his face a mask of apology, but she was no longer looking at him. Her gaze had dropped back to the tablecloth, but this time, it was different. The sequins on her dress seemed to dim, her shoulders slumped by a millimeter, a tiny, almost imperceptible collapse. A single shimmering tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracing a silent, glistening path down her cheek before she quickly, almost violently, brushed it away with the back of her hand. The light that had flickered in her eyes just moments before was extinguished, leaving behind a profound and desolate emptiness. She had become the statue again, but now, it was a statue carved from grief. From her position by the wall, Cora watched the entire exchange. The command to be invisible, to be a ghost, evaporated in a flash of white-hot rage. Every muscle in her body tensed. The silver pitcher in her hand felt heavy, cold, a potential weapon. Her job, her bills, her carefully constructed neutrality, it all dissolved in the face of such casual public cruelty. This wasn't just a husband being rude to his wife. This was a man using his wife's silence as a form of entertainment, a party trick for his sycophantic friends. He wasn't just mocking her, he was actively erasing her, painting her as a beautiful empty object for his own amusement. The word dumb hung in the air, ugly and poisonous. It was a lie, a cruel weapon designed to inflict maximum pain, and Cora could feel its impact as if it had been directed at her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw Annalise's trembling hand, the ghost of a tear on her perfect makeup. She saw Alistair, puffed up with his own vile importance, grinning as he accepted the backslaps of his friends. And in that moment, a decision was made. Not a reasoned, logical decision, but a deep, instinctual one. It was the same feeling that had guided her through the hardest moments of her life, a defiant spark that refused to be put out. She set the silver pitcher down on the sideboard. The small metallic sound was barely audible over the lingering chuckles, but for Cora, it was the ringing of a bell, signaling the start of a fight. She took a single deliberate step forward, away from the safety of the wall, out of the shadows. She was no longer a ghost. She was a presence. Her eyes, dark and resolute, locked onto Alistair. The arrogant billionaire had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had underestimated the maid. He had underestimated the wife. And now, the quietest person in the room was about to make the most noise. Cora's lips tightened into a thin, determined line. She began to walk towards the table, her steps slow, measured, and filled with a purpose that made the air itself seem to crackle with anticipation. The laughter began to die down as a few of the guests noticed her approach, their eyes wide with confusion. Alistair, still basking in his moment, hadn't seen her yet. But he would. Oh, he would. As Cora moved, the opulent dining room seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to the space between her and Alistair. The murmur of conversation faded into a low hum. Each step was a beat in a silent drumroll of confrontation. Alistair, finally sensing the shift in the room's energy, turned his head. He saw her coming, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "What is it?" he snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. "Can't you see we're in the middle of something?" He expected her to flinch, to apologize, to scurry back to the shadows where she belonged. He expected her to be another piece of furniture in his perfectly curated life. Cora stopped directly beside Annalise's chair, placing herself between the wife and the rest of the table, a silent protective barrier. She didn't look at Alistair. Her focus was entirely on the woman beside her. Softly, so softly that only Annalise could hear, she spoke. But the words were not spoken with her voice. They were spoken with her hands. With a grace and fluidity that was mesmerizing, Cora's fingers began to move, her hands dancing in the air. She was using sign language. "Are you all right?" she signed, her expression a stark contrast to her crisp professional uniform. It was full of warmth, concern, and a fierce protective gentleness. Annalise's head snapped up. Her eyes, wide with astonishment, flew from Cora's hands to her face. For a moment, she was completely still, as if she couldn't process what was happening. Someone was talking to her. Not at her, not about her, but to her. In her language. Alistair watched, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this nonsense? What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising. The other guests stared, mouths agape. This was not part of the evening's entertainment. This was an interruption, a bizarre and unwelcome one. Annalise ignored them all. A slow, hesitant light began to dawn in her eyes, chasing away the shadows of humiliation. Her own hands, which had been clenched so tightly in her lap, began to relax. Trembling slightly, she lifted them. Her fingers were clumsy at first, stiff from disuse and shock. But then, the movements became more confident. I am not," she signed back, her expression a heartbreaking mix of gratitude and pain. Her eyes welled with fresh tears, but these were different. These were not tears of shame. They were tears of recognition. Cora's gaze softened. She gave a small, encouraging nod. Then, she turned her head slowly, deliberately, to face Alistair. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard fire. She stood up to her full height, her posture radiating a quiet but unshakable authority that had nothing to do with wealth or status. Alistair, flustered and angry at having his authority challenged by a mere servant, opened his mouth to shout, to fire her, to have her thrown out. But he never got the chance. Because Cora began to sign again, her hands moving with a sharp, articulate precision. She didn't speak a word, letting the silence amplify the power of her actions. Her hands flew, fingers spelling out words, shaping concepts, weaving a narrative that every single person in that room could understand, even if they didn't know the language. Her expression did the talking. The furrow of her brow conveyed disappointment. The sharp, slicing motion of her hand conveyed judgment. The slight shake of her head conveyed a profound and utter contempt. Then, she did something that stunned the entire room into absolute silence. She looked directly at Alistair, her eyes burning with an intensity that made him physically recoil. And then she signed 5 simple, devastating words, her movements clear and undeniable for Annalise, and anyone else who might understand to see. But the meaning was clear on her face for all. She is not the dumb one. The message landed in the center of the room with the force of a physical blow. The air crackled. The laughter was a distant memory. The arrogant billionaire, a man who commanded boardrooms and brought competitors to their knees with his words, was, for the first time in a very long time, utterly and completely speechless. His mouth hung open, a wordless O of shock and fury. He had been shut up, not by a shout or an insult, but by the silent, powerful voice of a maid who saw the truth. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted, tilting away from the man at the head of the table and toward the two women who had just found each other in the quiet. Alistair's face, usually a mask of smug control, cycled through a series of emotions: shock, confusion, and finally, a deep, simmering rage. His jaw tightened, and a muscle twitched in his cheek. He had been publicly undermined. A servant in his own home, in front of his associates, had made him look like a fool without uttering a single syllable. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. The guests avoided his eyes, suddenly fascinated by their wine glasses, their plates, the intricate patterns on the ceiling. Julian, the young man who had tried to speak to Annalise, watched Cora with a look of undisguised admiration. "What did you say?" Alistair finally managed to get out, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the polished floor. Cora held his gaze, unflinching. She didn't repeat the signs. She didn't need to. The message had been delivered. Instead, she turned her attention back to Annalise. With a gentle, almost reverent touch, she placed a hand on Annalise's shoulder. The contact was electric. For Annalise, it felt like the first kind touch she had received in years. It was grounding, a silent affirmation that she was seen, that she was real. Cora then signed a simple question to her. Asterisk, do you want to leave? Asterisk. Annalise stared at Cora's hands, the question hanging in the air between them. Leave? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Leave the table? Leave the room? Leave this life? For years, her existence had been defined by this man, this house, this suffocating silence. Alistair had built a cage of wealth and isolation around her, and she had long ago stopped rattling the bars. He had convinced her, through 1,000 small cruelties and a handful of grand gestures of generosity, that she needed him. That without him, she was nothing. His voice had become the only one she heard, a constant looping track of criticism and condescension that had drowned out her own sense of self. But Cora's simple, silent act of defiance had shattered the illusion. It was a crack in the wall of the prison, letting in a sliver of impossible light. She looked at her husband, at his face contorted with rage, and for the first time, she didn't see a powerful, intimidating man. She saw a small, pathetic bully, a man so insecure that he needed to diminish his own wife to feel tall. The fear that had been her constant companion for years began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning anger of her own. She had been a pianist. A brilliant one. She had once filled concert halls with music, her hands telling stories on the ivory keys. But her deafness, a result of a sudden illness years ago, had been used by Alistair as a tool to isolate her, to cut her off from her passion and from the world. He called her dumb not because she couldn't think, but because she couldn't hear his voice, and to him, his voice was the only one that mattered. Annalise took a deep breath, the first one that felt like it had reached the bottom of her lungs. Her spine straightened. She met Alistair's furious gaze, and her expression was not one of fear or submission. It was one of clarity. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hands. Her movements were no longer clumsy or hesitant. They were sharp, clear, and full of a conviction that had been dormant for too long. Yes, she signed, her eyes locked on her husband's. Then she added another word, a word she had not dared to even think for years. Now. She pushed her chair back, her movements mirroring her husband's, but where his had been angry and aggressive, hers were graceful and decisive. She stood up. The gold sequins on her dress caught the light, and this time, she didn't seem to be fading into the background. She seemed to be glowing. Without a backward glance at the stunned guests or her apoplectic husband, she turned and walked toward the grand entryway of the dining room. Cora fell into step just behind her, a silent guardian. Where do you think you're going? Alistair bellowed, his voice finally breaking free from the paralysis of shock. Annalise. You get back here right now. The party is not over. His words were commands, the words of a man used to being obeyed without question. But they bounced off Annalise's back. They were just noise, meaningless vibrations in a world where she had just found a true voice. She didn't stop. She didn't even hesitate. She just kept walking. Alistair, humiliated and enraged, turned his fury on the only target left. "You," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Cora. "You're fired. Get out of my house. You will never work in this city again. I'll make sure of it." Cora paused for a second at the doorway and looked back at him over her shoulder. There was no fear in her eyes. There was only pity. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a final silent dismissal of him and his empty threats. Then she turned and followed Annalise out of the room, leaving Alistair Sterling standing alone in the wreckage of his perfectly controlled evening, surrounded by the silence of his so-called friends. The king was alone in his castle, and he had never looked so small. The door swung shut behind the two women, the soft click echoing in the vast, suddenly empty feeling room. The real story, the one that mattered, was just beginning. The massive oak doors of the Sterling mansion closed behind them, muffling the sound of Alistair's belated, furious shouts. For a moment, Annalise and Cora stood on the wide, manicured stone steps, bathed in the cool night air. The sounds of the city, a distant siren, the hum of traffic, were a strange and welcome symphony to Annalise's senses, a world of vibrations she had forgotten existed outside the oppressive quiet of her home. Annalise wrapped her arms around herself, not from the cold, but from the sheer, dizzying shock of her own actions. She had just walked out on her husband, in the middle of a dinner party, in front of his most important business associates. The audacity of it sent a tremor of both fear and exhilaration through her. Cora stood beside her, giving her space, allowing her the moment to process. She understood that Annalise was like a deep-sea diver brought to the surface too quickly. She needed time to decompress, to adjust to the change in pressure. "Are you cold?" Cora asked, her voice soft and even, breaking the silence between them. It was the first time Annalise had heard Cora's speaking voice. It was as calm and steady as her hands. Annalise shook her head, then realized the gesture was for a hearing person. She felt a flush of awkwardness. It had been so long since she had communicated with anyone new, anyone outside of Alistair's carefully controlled bubble. She turned to face Cora, the light from the mansion's ornate lanterns illuminating her features. She lifted her hands to sign, but hesitated. What was there to say? Thank you? Who are you? What now? The questions were a tangled mess in her mind. Cora seemed to understand. "My name is Cora," she said, simultaneously signing her name for Annalise. "We can go anywhere you want. Is there a friend? Family?" Annalise's shoulders fell slightly. Family. Her parents were gone. Her friends. Alistair had systematically pushed them all away, creating subtle conflicts, manufacturing slights, until her social circle had dwindled to nothing but his own. He had made her an island, with him as the only bridge to the mainland. She shook her head, signing a single, lonely word. No one. The finality of it hung in the cool night air. She was truly alone. The initial rush of defiance began to curdle into a raw, terrifying panic. What had she done? She had no money of her own. Alistair controlled all the finances. She had no job. She had nowhere to go. The gilded cage may have been a prison, but at least it was a familiar one. The freedom she had just seized felt vast and empty and frightening. Seeing the panic clouding Annalise's eyes, Cora acted quickly. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small worn leather wallet. From it, she took a key attached to a simple plastic tag. "I have a place," she said, her voice and hands working in tandem. "It's not like this," she gestured vaguely at the sprawling mansion behind them, "but it's safe. It's warm. You can stay with me." The offer was so simple, so direct. It was an act of pure, uncomplicated kindness, something Annalise had not experienced in a very long time. Tears sprang to Annalise's eyes again. "Why?" she signed, her movements small and uncertain. "Why are you helping me? You'll lose your job. He'll ruin you." Cora's expression was serious. "Some things are more important than a job," she said, her voice imbued with a quiet strength. She looked Annalise directly in the eye. "No one deserves to be treated like that. No one deserves to be silenced." The way she said the word silenced resonated deep within Annalise. It was the perfect word for her existence. She hadn't just been ignored, she had been actively, deliberately silenced. The choice was clear. She could turn back, walk through those doors, and beg Alistair for forgiveness. She could retreat to the familiar pain of her life, to the beautiful prison where she was nothing more than a decoration. Or she could take a step into the unknown, with a stranger who had shown her more compassion in 10 minutes than her husband had in 10 years. She looked at the key in Cora's hand. It was just a small piece of metal, but it represented a door to a new life. It was a choice. A terrifying, beautiful choice. Annalise looked at Cora's steady, reassuring face, and made her decision. She reached out and took the key. Her fingers brushed against Cora's, and in that brief contact, a bond was forged. It was a fragile, tentative connection, born of a shared moment of defiance, but it was real. For the first time in a very long time, Annalise felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost forever: hope. She gave a small, determined nod. Together, the two women turned their backs on the mansion and walked down the long, winding driveway, away from the glittering lights and into the welcoming darkness of the city. They didn't know where the path would lead, but for the first time, they were walking it together. Cora's apartment was on the third floor of a modest, pre-war brick building in a neighborhood that hummed with the quiet, persistent life of the city. The hallway smelled of garlic and old wood, a stark contrast to the sterile, perfumed air of the Sterling mansion. When Cora turned the key in the lock, the door opened into a space that was the complete opposite of everything Annalise had known. It was small, but it was filled with a vibrant, personal warmth. Books were stacked in precarious piles on the floor, a half-finished painting of a fiery sunset rested on an easel by the window, and a collection of mismatched, colorful mugs hung from hooks in the tiny kitchen. It wasn't a showroom, it was a home. Annalise stood awkwardly in the entryway, her glittering gold dress looking absurdly out of place amidst the comfortable clutter. She felt like a creature from another planet. The sheer reality of her situation began to sink in. She had walked out of her life with nothing but the clothes on her back, a designer gown that was now a symbol of her captivity, and a stranger's key. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape was beginning to wear off, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a growing dread. What if Alistair came for her? What if he cut her off completely? The thought sent a jolt of panic through her. She wrapped her arms around herself again, a fragile defense against the overwhelming uncertainty. Cora, sensing her distress, moved with a quiet efficiency. "Here," she said softly, handing Annalise a soft, oversized gray sweatshirt and a pair of worn cotton pajama pants. "Change into these. You'll be more comfortable." She gestured towards a small, clean bathroom. While Annalise was changing, Cora busied herself in the kitchen, her movements practiced and soothing. She filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove, the low hiss of the gas flame a comforting sound. She took down two of the mismatched mugs, one a cheerful yellow, the other a deep, calming blue. When Annalise emerged from the bathroom, she felt like she was shedding a skin. The heavy, constricting sequin dress lay in a shimmering heap on the floor, and in its place, the soft, worn fabric of the sweatshirt and pants felt like a gentle hug. Her elaborate hairstyle had been taken down, her blonde hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She looked younger, more vulnerable, but also more real. She sat down hesitantly on the edge of a plush, well-loved sofa. Cora brought the two mugs of steaming tea and set them on the small wooden coffee table. She sat in the armchair opposite Annalise, curling her legs underneath her. She didn't press. She didn't ask questions. She simply sat, creating a space of quiet safety. After a few moments of silence, Annalise reached for the blue mug, her hands wrapping around its warmth. She took a slow sip. The chamomile tea was simple and soothing, and it calmed the frantic fluttering in her chest. Finally, she looked at Cora, her eyes full of 1,000 unspoken questions. The most pressing one tumbled out in a series of hesitant signs. "Why do you know my language?" It was a question that had been nagging at her since the moment Cora had first moved her hands. Cora's expression softened, and a shadow of old sadness passed through her eyes. "My little brother Leo," she began, her voice quiet and her hands moving in perfect sync. "He was born deaf. He was the brightest, funniest kid you could ever meet. He taught me how to sign before I could even read properly." She smiled at the memory, a genuine warm smile that lit up her face. Our hands were our secret world. We could talk across a crowded room, tell jokes that no one else understood. She paused, her gaze drifting towards the window, as if looking into the past. He taught me that silence isn't emptiness. It's just a different kind of space. And he taught me that the cruelest thing you can do to a person is to make them feel like they're invisible, like their voice doesn't matter, just because it's different from yours. Cora looked back at Annalise, her eyes locking with hers. When I saw your husband, when I heard what he said, I saw the same look on your face that I saw on my brother's face 100 times, when people would get impatient or mock him or just talk over him like he wasn't there. A single tear traced a path down Cora's cheek, and she didn't bother to wipe it away. Leo passed away a few years ago. An infection that the doctors caught too late. The simple, devastating fact hung in the air between them. I promised myself after he was gone that I would never again stand by and watch someone be treated that way. I would never let someone else feel that loneliness if I could do something about it. So when I saw Alistair do that to you, I couldn't stay silent. For you. And for Leo. The story, so full of love and loss, settled deep in Annalise's heart. Cora's actions hadn't been born of pity. They had been born of empathy, of a shared understanding of a pain Annalise had thought was hers alone to bear. The wall that Annalise had built around herself for years, a fortress of solitude and resignation, began to crumble. Tears streamed down her face, silent, heartfelt sobs for the years she had lost, for the music she had stopped playing, for the voice she had allowed to be stolen. But they were also tears of gratitude for the stranger who had seen her, truly seen her, and reached out a hand. Cora didn't move to comfort her. She just sat there, a steady, patient presence, letting Annalise grieve. She understood that some storms have to be weathered, not stopped. In the quiet, humble apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of a beloved brother and the beginnings of a new, unexpected friendship, Annalise cried until she had no tears left. And when it was over, she felt lighter. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but for the first time in a very long time, it was not the only thing she felt. She also felt a fragile, tentative seedling of strength, planted by an act of kindness and watered by a shared story of loss and love. The first few days in Cora's apartment were a strange, disorienting blur for Annalise. The quiet of the small space was different from the oppressive silence of the mansion. Here, the quiet was gentle, punctuated by the sounds of a life being lived. Cora humming as she painted, the rustle of book pages turning, the gentle clinking of dishes being washed. It was a peaceful quiet, a healing quiet. Annalise spent most of her time curled on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, drifting between sleep and a state of numb exhaustion. The life she had known had been surgically removed, and she was left in a state of phantom pain, her mind still reaching for routines and expectations that no longer existed. Every time the phone buzzed on the coffee table, Cora's phone, Annalise would flinch, her heart pounding with the fear that it was Alistair. He would be looking for her, she was sure of it. He wouldn't let his prized possession just walk away. His pride wouldn't allow it. Cora, noticing her reaction, would always check the phone with a calm, reassuring glance. "It's just my sister," she'd say. Or, "a text from the agency." She never offered more information, but her steadiness was a balm to Annalise's frayed nerves. What do you think is the hardest part about leaving a toxic situation? Is it the fear of the unknown, or the pain of letting go of what's familiar, even if it's bad for you? Share your thoughts in the comments. One afternoon, Cora came home from a shift at a catering event and found Annalise staring blankly at the TV, the screen dark. She hadn't moved from the sofa all day. Cora saw the deep, hollow look in her eyes, the look of someone who was beginning to fade. "Annalise," Cora said, sitting down beside her. She signed as she spoke, her movements gentle but firm. "You can't stay here forever. Not on this couch. He's taken so much from you. Don't let him take the rest." Annalise's hands trembled as she signed back. "He has everything. My money. My home. He has my life." "No, he doesn't," Cora insisted, her gaze intense. "He has things. He has buildings and bank accounts. He doesn't have you. Not anymore. You walked out of there. That was you. All you." She leaned forward, her voice dropping, becoming more urgent. What did you love, Annalise? Before him. What was yours? The question was like a key turning a lock in a long-forgotten room in her mind. A dusty, cobwebbed image flickered into view. Her hands, flying across the black and white keys of a grand piano. The vibration of the music through the floorboards, a feeling she could still sense even after her hearing faded. The roar of a crowd rising to their feet, a vibration of approval that she could feel in her very bones. Music, she signed, the word hesitant, fragile, like a precious artifact unearthed after centuries. Asterisk, I was a pianist. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Cora's face. I know, she said. The guest at the party, Julian, he mentioned it. I looked you up. She reached for her laptop, which was sitting on the coffee table. She typed quickly and then turned the screen towards Annalise. It was a video from over a decade ago. The quality was grainy, but the image was unmistakable. It was a younger Annalise, her face full of passion and concentration, her hands a blur of motion as she played a frantic, beautiful piece by Chopin. The music swelled from the laptop's small speakers, a cascade of notes that was both joyful and heartbreaking. Annalise stared at the woman on the screen, a stranger she barely recognized. That woman was fearless. That woman was alive. Where had she gone? As she watched, a notification popped up on the bottom of the screen. It was an email. From Alistair Sterling. Subject, an ultimatum. Annalise's blood ran cold. Cora saw her expression and immediately took the laptop. Her face hardened as she read the email. It's from his lawyers, she said, her voice grim. He's filed for divorce. On grounds of abandonment. He's offering you a settlement. She read the terms, her voice laced with disgust. A one-time payment. Small. Insultingly small. On the condition that you sign a non-disclosure agreement. You can never speak about him, your marriage, or anything that happened in that house. He wants to buy your silence. Permanently. The words hit Annalise like a physical blow. He wasn't trying to get her back. He was trying to erase her. To pay her off and ensure she disappeared quietly, taking his dirty secrets with her. It was the ultimate act of dismissal. He was confirming what he had said all along. She was worthless to him. An object to be discarded when it was no longer convenient. The last vestiges of her hope that a part of him might have cared for her, that their history meant something, withered and died. She felt a profound and chilling emptiness. He was going to win. He had all the power, all the money, all the lawyers. He was going to wipe her off the face of the earth, and she would be left with nothing. But as she looked at the screen, at the face of the passionate young woman playing the piano, a different feeling began to stir within her. A spark of defiance. He could take her home, her money, her name. But he couldn't take that woman. He couldn't take the music that still lived in her soul, in her hands. He thought he could buy her silence. But her truest voice had never been in words. It had been in the music. The music he had tried so hard to make her forget. Annalise looked from the cold, legalistic words of the email to the vibrant, passionate woman in the video. And she made a choice. She would not be erased. She would not be silenced. She was going to fight back. Not with lawyers, not with words. She was going to fight back with the only thing that had ever truly been hers. She was going to play again. The decision to play again was one thing, a deep gut-level roar of defiance. The reality of it was another. Annalise hadn't touched a piano in almost 5 years. Not since Alistair had surprised her by selling her beloved Steinway Grand, replacing it with a monstrous, abstract metal sculpture he'd paid a fortune for. It's a better investment, darling, he had explained, patting her shoulder condescendingly. More of a conversation piece. The message was clear. Her music was a hobby, a noise. His art was a statement. After that, she had simply stopped. The grief of the loss, coupled with his constant dismissals, had been too much. Her hands, once so full of life and music, had become quiet and still. Now, sitting in Cora's sunlit living room, she looked down at those same hands. They felt foreign, clumsy. Could they still remember? Cora, seeing the doubt in her eyes, took immediate action. "There's a community center a few blocks from here," she said, already pulling on her jacket. "They have a music room. An old upright piano, nothing fancy. But it's there. And it's free." The walk to the center was nerve-wracking. Every step felt like a step towards a verdict. When they entered the small, slightly dusty music room, Annalise's heart pounded in her chest. There it was. An old, scarred wooden upright piano, sitting in a pool of afternoon light. It was a world away from the polished, perfectly tuned grand pianos of her past, but it was beautiful. It was an invitation. She approached it slowly, reverently, and ran her fingers lightly over the keys. They were cool to the touch. She sat down on the wobbly bench, her posture stiff, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Cora stood quietly by the door, giving her space. Annalise closed her eyes, trying to summon a melody, a simple scale, anything. But her mind was a blank canvas. The fear of failure was a physical weight, pressing down on her. What if she couldn't do it? What if the music was really gone? What if Alistair was right? What if she was just an empty shell? Her hands trembled. She couldn't do it. She was about to stand up, to run from the room, from the judgment of those silent keys, when she felt a gentle touch on her shoulder. It was Cora. She didn't say anything. She didn't sign. She just stood there, her hand a small point of warmth and steady pressure. It was the same simple grounding gesture she had used in the dining room. A silent message, "I am here. You are not alone." Annalise took a deep, shaky breath. She looked at Cora, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. Then she looked back at the piano. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for Cora, the woman who had shown her such extraordinary kindness. She was playing for Leo, the brother she had never met but whose spirit had saved her. She was playing for the woman in the video, the girl who had been so full of fire and passion. She placed her fingers on the keys. And she began to play. It wasn't Chopin. It wasn't a grand, sweeping concerto. It was a simple, hesitant melody. A folk song that her mother used to hum. The first few notes were clumsy, uncertain. A few were wrong. But then, something clicked. A muscle memory, buried deep beneath years of silence and grief, sparked back to life. Her fingers began to move with more confidence, finding their way along the familiar landscape of the keys. The melody grew stronger, more fluid. The music filled the small room, a sound of pure, unadorned beauty. It was a sound of homecoming. Annalise wasn't just playing the piano. She was finding herself again, one note at a time. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. She played through the tears, pouring all her pain, her anger, her hope into the music. It was a lament and a celebration all at once. A requiem for the life she had lost, and an anthem for the one she was just beginning to build. Cora watched, her own eyes wet with tears. She was witnessing a resurrection. It wasn't just about music. It was about a human spirit refusing to be broken. Annalise played for nearly an hour, moving from the simple folk song to fragments of Bach and Debussy, the complex pieces of her past returning to her hands like long-lost friends. When she finally finished, her hands came to rest in her lap. The room was silent, but this silence was different. It was filled with the echoes of the music, with the warmth of accomplishment. Annalise was exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion. The kind that comes after a long, hard journey home. She looked at her hands, no longer foreign, but her own. They were capable. They were strong. They had a voice. And she was finally ready to let it be heard. That night, back in the apartment, a new energy crackled between them. The fragile bond of shared defiance had deepened into a true and solid friendship. They sat at the small kitchen table, eating a simple meal of pasta and salad, and for the first time, Annalise was an active participant in the conversation. She told Cora, with her hands flying, about her childhood, her love for music, her dreams of playing in the great concert halls of Europe. She told her about the illness that had stolen her hearing, and how Alistair had at first seemed like a savior, a strong, powerful man who would take care of her. She spoke of the slow, insidious way he had isolated her, turning her disability into a weakness, a tool for his control. As she signed, Cora listened, her expression full of a deep, compassionate understanding. He didn't just silence you, Cora said, her own hands echoing her words. He tried to take the one thing that was yours and make it his to break. But he couldn't. It's still in you. Annalise looked at the legal papers from Alistair's lawyers, which were sitting in a neat, damning pile on the counter. The non-disclosure agreement. The paltry sum of money meant to buy her silence. Before, it had looked like a death sentence. Now, it looked like a challenge. I'm not going to sign it, Annalise declared, her sign sharp and decisive. Cora grinned. I know, she said. So what are we going to do about it? A plan began to form, a wild, audacious idea sparked by the music and fueled by their shared determination. Alistair wanted to erase her, to make her a silent, forgotten footnote in his grand life story. But Annalise had just rediscovered her voice. And she was about to compose her own ending. It wouldn't be a quiet one. It would be a symphony. The plan was bold, risky, and depended entirely on the one person who had shown Annalise a sliver of kindness in Alistair's world, Julian. Cora found his name in an old society column online, identifying him as the junior partner at a rival investment firm. Men like Alistair, they don't have friends, Cora reasoned, pacing her small living room. They have assets and liabilities. Julian works for a competitor. Alistair humiliated him at that dinner as much as he did you. He might be willing to listen. Annalise agreed. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. She remembered the look of genuine empathy on Julian's face that night. He was different from the others. Using a burner phone Cora had bought for cash, Annalise sent him a simple, direct text. This is Annalise Sterling. I need your help. What my husband did was not just cruel, it was a lie. I can prove it. Meet me. She included the address of a small, neutral coffee shop, a time, and nothing more. For 2 agonizing days, there was no reply. Annalise's newfound hope began to waver. Maybe Cora was wrong. Maybe Julian was just another one of Alistair's circle, too afraid to cross him. Then, on the 3rd morning, a reply came. A single word, okay. The meeting felt like a scene from a spy movie. Annalise, dressed in simple anonymous clothes borrowed from Cora, sat in a booth at the back of the coffee shop, her nerves on fire. When Julian walked in, he looked just as nervous, his eyes darting around the room before he spotted her. Annalise, he said, sliding into the booth. I wasn't sure you'd actually. After that night. He trailed off, his embarrassment still palpable. Annalise got straight to the point. With Cora sitting beside her, acting as a discreet interpreter, she laid out the truth. She told him about her career, about the illness, and about how Alistair had systematically dismantled her life and her confidence. She showed him the email from Alistair's lawyers, the insulting settlement, the demand for her silence. He didn't just call me dumb, she explained, her hands moving with a passionate intensity. He has spent years trying to make me believe it. He is trying to bury me. To bury the truth. Julian listened, his expression shifting from surprise to a quiet, simmering anger. I always knew there was something off about him, he said, shaking his head. The way he treats people, it's a sickness of the soul. But this. He looked at the legal papers. This is monstrous. He looked at Annalise, truly seeing the intelligent, vibrant woman who had been hidden behind the silent facade. What do you want to do? He asked. What do you need from me? This was the moment. Alistair is hosting his annual charity gala in 2 weeks, Annalise signed, her plan unfolding. It's his biggest event of the year. The press, his investors, everyone who matters to him will be there. It's his coronation. And there's always a musical performance. Julian's eyes widened as he began to understand. You want to be the performance. Yes, she signed. He thinks I am a broken, silent object he has discarded. I want him to see who I really am. I want everyone to see. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. To walk back into the lion's den, not as a victim, but as the main event. It was a declaration of war. Julian was silent for a long moment, weighing the risks. Crossing Alistair Sterling was a career-ending move. It could get him blacklisted in the industry. But then he looked at Annalise's face, at her eyes shining with a fierce, desperate hope. He remembered the casual cruelty of that dinner, and the choice became simple. It was about more than business. It was about right and wrong. "The gala's musical program is managed by my aunt," Julian said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "She's always complaining about the boring, stuffy classical musicians they hire. I think she would be thrilled to have a last-minute surprise guest performer. A celebrated concert pianist making her triumphant return to the stage." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's give them a show they'll never forget." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of clandestine activity. While Julian worked his magic, pulling strings and arranging the surprise performance, Annalise and Cora prepared for battle. They found a dress for Annalise at a high-end consignment shop, a simple, elegant gown of deep crimson. It was the color of defiance, of life. It was the opposite of the shimmering gold cage she had worn. Most importantly, Annalise practiced. Every day, she and Cora would go to the community center, and Annalise would play for hours, her hands rediscovering their strength, their speed, their voice. She chose her piece carefully, Chopin's revolutionary Etude. It was a piece of staggering difficulty and furious passion, a storm of notes that sounded like a cry for freedom. It was a declaration. It was her story, told in music. As the day of the gala approached, Annalise felt a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. The thought of facing Alistair, of standing on that stage in front of all those people, was overwhelming. What if her hands froze? What if she failed? The night before the gala, she broke down. "I can't do it, Cora," she cried, her body trembling. "He'll destroy me. He'll look at me and I'll fall apart." Cora took Annalise's hands in her own. They were strong, capable hands, the hands of a musician. "Listen to me," Cora said, her gaze firm and unwavering. She signed as she spoke, ensuring every word landed. "He has had your fear for years. It has fed him and made him strong. Do not give him one more ounce of it. Tomorrow night, when you walk out on that stage, you are not his wife. You are not his victim. You are Annalise, the musician. You are playing for you. You are playing for every person who has ever been told to be quiet. You are playing for Leo." She squeezed Annalise's hands. "Your music is your truth. Just tell the truth. The rest will follow." Cora's words were a shield, an armor of purpose. Annalise's fear didn't disappear, but it shifted. It was no longer a weight holding her down, but a current of energy propelling her forward. She was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for something bigger. She squeezed Cora's hands back. She was ready. The revolution was about to begin. The night of the Sterling Charity Gala was a spectacle of obscene wealth. The ballroom of the city's most expensive hotel was draped in crystal and silk, the air buzzing with the conversations of the powerful and the clinking of champagne flutes. At the center of it all stood Alistair Sterling, a king in his element. He was radiant, accepting praise for his generosity, his arm draped casually around a stunningly beautiful woman, a model whose name he had likely just learned. He had already replaced Annalise, displaying his new prize with the same proprietary pride. To the world, his divorce was a minor inconvenience, a footnote he had already moved past. He was untouchable. Hidden in a small backstage dressing room, Annalise felt the vibrations of the crowd through the floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum solo of fear and adrenaline. She smoothed the deep crimson fabric of her gown. Cora stood beside her, a silent, steady presence. She adjusted the sleeve of Annalise's dress, her touch a small gesture of solidarity. She then handed Annalise a small folded piece of paper. On it, she had written, "They are not listening for mistakes. They are listening for a story. Tell them yours." Annalise clutched the note, its simple truth a lifeline in the overwhelming sea of her anxiety. Julian appeared at the door, his face pale with nerves but his eyes shining with excitement. "It's time," he mouthed. "They've just announced a surprise musical guest. He has no idea." Alistair was on stage, basking in the glow of the spotlight, a microphone in his hand. "And it is in that spirit of giving that we have one final treat for you tonight," he was saying, his voice smooth and practiced. A special performance to close out the evening. He gestured grandly to the side of the stage, where a magnificent black grand piano sat, gleaming under the lights. He expected a string quartet, or perhaps the aging opera singer his event planner had suggested. He did not expect to see his wife. When Annalise walked onto the stage, a collective gasp rippled through the audience. The murmuring fell away, replaced by a stunned, electric silence. She didn't look at the crowd. Her gaze was fixed forward, her posture regal and her steps deliberate. She was a vision in crimson, a stark, breathtaking contrast to the pale golds and silvers of the ballroom. Alistair froze. For a moment, the mask of charming benevolence slipped, revealing the raw shock and fury beneath. His knuckles were white where he gripped the microphone. What was she doing here? This was his night. His stage. His world. How did she get in? He looked wildly around, his eyes finding Julian in the wings, who met his furious gaze with a cool, triumphant stare. The betrayal was absolute. Annalise reached the piano. She sat, adjusting the bench, a simple, professional movement. She took a moment, placing her hands on her lap, and closed her eyes. The entire room held its breath. She was not the timid, broken woman Alistair had cast aside. This was someone else. Someone powerful. She thought of Cora's note. Tell them your story. She took a deep breath, feeling the vibrations of the silent, expectant room. And then, she began to play. The first notes of the revolutionary etude exploded from the piano, a crashing, tumultuous chord that shattered the silence like a bolt of lightning. It was not a gentle melody. It was a declaration of war. Her hands, once so hesitant, were a blur of controlled fury. The music poured out of her, a torrent of sound that was both technically brilliant and raw with emotion. It was the sound of a cage breaking. It was the sound of a storm that had been brewing for years, finally unleashed. The audience was mesmerized, captivated by the sheer force of her performance. They were witnessing not just a piece of music, but an act of profound and personal rebellion. Alistair stood on the side of the stage, trapped in the spotlight's glare, a prisoner in his own party. The music was an accusation, each powerful chord a judgment against him. He saw it all in that moment, his cruelty, his arrogance, his pathetic need to diminish her to feel powerful. The beautiful, silent object he thought he had broken was on his stage, in his spotlight, speaking a language more powerful than any words he could command, and telling the entire world who he really was. He was being exposed, dismantled, note by furious note. His face, broadcast on the huge screens flanking the stage, was a mask of horror and impotent rage. Annalise played on, lost in the music. She was no longer afraid. She was free. The years of silence, of humiliation, of being made to feel small and worthless, it all poured out through her fingertips, transformed from pain into a breathtaking, ferocious beauty. She was not just playing the piano, she was reclaiming her life, her power, her soul. As she reached the final, triumphant chords, she poured every last ounce of her strength into them. The music swelled, a final defiant roar of victory, before ending in a sudden dramatic silence. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. The last chord hung in the air, vibrating with a power that was almost tangible. Annalise kept her hands on the keys, her head bowed, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the performance. Then, someone began to clap. A single person. Then another. And another. And then the entire ballroom erupted. It wasn't polite, charitable applause. It was a roar. A standing ovation. People were on their feet, their faces a mixture of awe and admiration. They had heard her story. And they understood. Annalise slowly lifted her head. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the thunderous applause, and for the first time, she did not feel their judgment. She felt their connection. She had spoken in the only way she knew how, and they had heard her. Her gaze swept past them, past the cheering crowd, and landed on one person. Alistair. He stood alone, his face pale, his empire of lies crumbling around him. Their eyes met across the stage. There was no hatred in her gaze. There was no anger. There was only a calm, quiet finality. She had won. And then, she looked to the wings. Cora was there, her face streaked with tears, her smile the brightest thing in the room. Beside her, Julian was clapping so hard his hands were red. Annalise's own eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of joy, of overwhelming, unbelievable relief. She had done it. She had faced her monster, and she had not just survived, she had triumphed. She gave a small, graceful bow to the audience. Her revolution was complete. The silence had been broken, and the music, her music, had won. In the aftermath of the gala, the story spread like wildfire. It wasn't just society gossip, it was a headline. Silenced pianist's triumphant return, one newspaper blared. Billionaire's gala ends in revolution, read another. The video of Annalise's performance, captured on 100 cell phones, went viral. The world saw not just a brilliant musician, but a woman taking back her power. They saw the fury and passion in her playing, and they saw Alistair Sterling's face, exposed and humiliated in the spotlight. His carefully crafted image was shattered, replaced by the ugly truth of a petty, cruel bully. His calls for damage control went unanswered. His investors grew wary. The world had seen the man behind the curtain, and they were not impressed. Annalise, however, was insulated from the storm. She and Cora had slipped out a back exit of the hotel and disappeared back into the quiet anonymity of Cora's neighborhood. The day after the gala, they sat in the living room, a comfortable silence between them, watching the news reports on the laptop. Annalise watched with a sense of detachment, as if watching a movie about someone else. The woman in the crimson dress on the screen looked so strong, so fearless. Was that really her? A knock on the door made them both jump. Cora opened it to find Julian, holding a large bouquet of deep red roses. "For the maestro," he said with a grin, handing them to Annalise. "I have some news." He came in, his energy buzzing. "Alistair's lawyers have been calling me non-stop. And not just me. They've been calling my aunt, the hotel, the charity board. They are in full-blown panic mode." He paused for dramatic effect. "And I just got off the phone with a new lawyer. Yours." Annalise looked at him, confused. "My lawyer," she signed. "Yes," Julian said, his smile widening. "It seems Alistair's original settlement offer is off the table. A new one has been proposed. He is conceding everything. The house, a generous portion of his assets, and most importantly," Julian's eyes gleamed, "the non-disclosure agreement is gone. He's desperate to make this go away. He's trying to buy your silence again, but this time, the price is much, much higher." Annalise stared at him, the news slowly sinking in. She thought of the mansion, the gilded cage. She no longer wanted it. She thought of the money. It was power, yes, but not the kind she was interested in. She looked around Cora's small, cluttered, loving apartment. This felt more like a home than that cold, empty mansion ever had. She looked at Cora, her friend, the woman who had saved her. She looked at Julian, the kind stranger who had risked his own career to help her. This was her wealth. She took a deep breath and signed her decision, her movements clear and certain. "I will accept," she signed. "On one condition." Julian and Cora both leaned in, curious. "The money I receive from him," she continued, "I want to use it to start a foundation. A foundation that provides musical education and resources for deaf and hard-of-hearing children. I want to call it the Leo Project." Cora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears instantly filled her eyes as she looked at Annalise, her heart overflowing with a love and gratitude so profound it left her breathless. It was the most beautiful, perfect tribute to her brother's memory she could ever have imagined. His legacy, which had lived on in her quiet acts of defiance, would now become a symphony of hope for countless others. Julian was speechless for a moment, simply shaking his head in admiration. "Annalise," he said finally, his voice full of respect. "That is incredible." "Yes. Of course. We'll make it happen." The final choice was made. Not in a courtroom, not in a lawyer's office, but in a small third-floor apartment, between three people who would become an unlikely family. It wasn't a choice born of revenge or greed. It was a choice born of hope, of generosity, of turning a story of pain into a legacy of love. Annalise looked at the crimson roses Julian had brought, their color so vibrant and alive. They were the color of her dress, the color of her revolution. She knew her life would never be the same. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, it was her own. She was no longer a victim, no longer a silent wife. She was the founder of the Leo Project. She was a musician. And her greatest composition was just beginning. A year later, the first Leo Project Community Center opened its doors. It was a bright, beautiful space, filled with light and color. But most importantly, it was filled with sound and silence. In one room, children were learning to play drums, feeling the rhythm vibrate through the floor. In another, a group was gathered around a special piano, its keys lighting up with corresponding colors as they were played. And in the main hall, standing before a small, eager class of children, was Annalise. She was not the hesitant, fearful woman who had walked out of a mansion. She was confident, her smile easy and genuine. She was dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, her hands moving with an expressive grace that was mesmerizing to watch. She was teaching them the basics of sign language, weaving it together with musical theory. Her assistant and the center's co-director, Cora, stood beside her, occasionally adding a spoken word for the hearing parents in the room, her face beaming with pride. After the class, Annalise sat at the light-up piano, her fingers dancing across the keys. A little girl, no older than 7, with bright, curious eyes, came and stood beside her. She watched Annalise's hands, fascinated. Annalise smiled and slid over on the bench, patting the space beside her. The little girl eagerly climbed up. Annalise guided the child's small hand, showing her how to press a key. A single clear note rang out, and the key lit up in a brilliant blue. The girl's face lit up with a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. Looking at that smile, Annalise felt a sense of peace so profound it almost brought her to tears. She had lost so much, but she had gained infinitely more. She had found her voice, not in spoken words, but in her music, in her actions, in the legacy she was building. She had found a purpose far greater than playing in any concert hall. She had found a family, not of blood but of choice, in Cora, her sister in all but name, and in Julian, who had become a dear friend and a board member of the foundation. As the sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, Annalise played a simple, hopeful melody. The little girl beside her tentatively pressed another key, adding her own note to the song. It was a beautiful harmony. The sound of a new beginning. The cruel words of her ex-husband, "Talk to my dumb wife," were a distant, meaningless echo from another lifetime. Alistair Sterling had been relegated to a cautionary tale, a lonely man in a big, empty house. But Annalise was here, surrounded by life, by hope, by music. She had found her voice. And now, she was teaching a new generation how to find theirs. In the end, it was not Alistair who had the last word. It was the music. And the music was beautiful. What does it truly mean to find your voice? Is it about speaking up, or is it about finding the unique way you can share your story with the world? I'd love to read your beautiful thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this journey today.